Hello, and welcome back to the Sustainability Talks podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Sheehan, managing partner at ETF Partners, Europe's oldest and leading venture capital firm focused on backing businesses that deliver what we call sustainability through innovation. In today's episode of Sustainability Talks, we're talking to Mark Zanoli, the Global Chair of Banking for Barclays Investment Bank. He's got 30 years experience in tech banking in Silicon Valley and across the world. We're talking to Mark about the banner year 2021 and what it's been like for tech companies, how digital technologies are enabling and driving change across a wide range of industries at increasing speed, and the need for sustainability that has also been driving this change. Leading this talk with Mark are my co-host and managing partner at ETF, Rob Genieser, and our partner, Remy de Tonnac.
I thought I would just say a few words, first of all, about Remy, Mark, because Remy, in addition to being a great investor, started out as an entrepreneur. So he took Gem Plus public back in the day, a company he helped start. That went on to be acquired in a very big acquisition. And so he knows IPOs and M&A. He did the same thing with Inside Secure, which he actually bought a few companies along the way. So when we hear from Remy, we hear from somebody who's been eating your cooking, Mark, because you've been one of the leading, I think, advisors to technology companies around the world. I am privileged to know you because you and I have worked together for 25 years, I added up, and that is quite a while. First in Silicon Valley, and you really have been the advisor to a lot of the most prominent people in the technology space. But what people probably don't know is you're a really good guy. And a fantastic spokesman, I think, for what we do. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I might just start out with a little bit of reminiscing because you've been at it for a long time. I've been at it for a while. And I'm just curious with something very simple is how you've seen technology changing over the last 25 years. And I'm going to give you a very general question to start. Maybe we dig in a little bit.
Sure. First of all, Rob, I got to hire you as my PR agent. That's the nicest introduction I've had ever. Really a pleasure to be with everyone today. So I'd say, Rob, as it relates to technology, when you and I were together those many, many, many years ago, technology was its own industry. And so much of what we did in the old days, we had this kind of serial system where Intel would build a chip, Microsoft would build an operating system, and then people would write applications on that operating system. And by the time the operating system was out there in commercial availability, the chip that ran it was obsolete. And so you had this serial level of technology development. And what's changed over these many years is we've had this parallel development going on. I think where you most experienced, I was in Las Vegas last week with the CEO of Amazon Web Services. He had a bad week this week. He had a better week the week before. But when I was listening to his presentation, they were doing all sorts of cool things in software, but at the same time, they had introduced the Graviton 3, which is their chipset, doing really sophisticated things in AI and ML, et cetera. And so, Rob, what I would say is, as a result of that now parallelism rather than serialism in technology innovation, it's meant that the speed of application of technology has expanded. And what I see most today, and I think germane to this conversation, is technology is no longer chips, software, and computers. Technology is embedded into the fabric of every company out there. And it is the benefits of the new innovation that are leading to real change. And it's happening faster than I can ever remember in my very long, because I am old, history of doing technology banking. It's super exciting.
And Mark, maybe just a follow-up question, then I'll let Remy take the floor. And I'm actually thinking of entrepreneurs like Remy back in the day. I think people used to build technology companies for technology's sake. And what I mean by that is they love technology. And I think there was a period of time, and maybe it's still true today for many companies, it's all about making money. And now, of course, we see more mission-driven companies. Would you like to comment just sort of on those trends, as well as how the entrepreneur has sort of shifted over the generations, if you would?
Sure. And again, I probably have a more unique Silicon Valley perspective on this because I live here and have lived here my entire life. But I do think it's increasingly pervasive. if you want to be a great company today, just from a brand perspective, both for your employees as well as your customers, it seems to me that if you go back to the old Milton Friedman, just maximize profits, you're not going to be successful. That your product has to resonate and your services have to resonate, again, with all of your constituents. And today, I would say the largest, most vocal part of that are the employees. I think employees want to follow leaders who are mission driven, as you described, and they feel like they get up every day and they go to work. Now there are extremes of this, as we see in the world. There are extremes on everything, and there are like vocal minorities that are just insane because they won't let a company actually run a real business. And I have CFOs at all of the major companies that are dear friends of mine, and they won't say anything bad publicly. But I can tell you privately, they're like, look, the inmates are kind of running the asylum, and we've given them this voice because we want them to be included, but it can go too far. And so I think we're living within that. But Rob, I would say there's not a new company started where the goal of the founder, at least publicly, is just about making money. I would say privately, look, people would like to be rich. That is never too far from the surface either.
And yeah, when you were saying what happened with technology push-pull, it was reminding me of, it was a very nice documentary about the history of Silicon Valley, where an ex-Intel guy was saying, 70s, 80s, we were behind kind of a wall, we were developing great tech, we were throwing over the wall, and they were calling for more. And one day we got it back on the head. And then we had to wonder, what do we need to do? What do they want? To ask ourselves, what do they want? Leaving the historical perspective, but staying on big trends and some that are questioning ourselves. Markets today seem pretty frothy, and in some cases perceived as a bit exuberant, especially when it comes to some electric vehicle, electric truck IPO. Should we be worried?
So Remy, that's a bit of a loaded question. So we were proudly an underwriter to Rivian, for example, which was captivating to the world. I would say in the case of Rivian, I'm an enormous fan of RJ, the CEO and founder of that company. He was off in the wilderness for a long time, coming back to Michigan where his roots were, but having been educated at MIT. And you talk about a mission-driven person. He really wants to change the world. And his view of changing the world, and I think this goes back to the previous panel, changing the world for just changing the world's sake doesn't typically build good businesses. And what RJ said is, if you look at vehicle sales in the United States, 72% of all vehicles sold in the United States are light trucks or SUVs. So if we can build these nice sedans and small cars, that's great. But if you really want to change the world and change the environment, let's build a vehicle that people actually really want to buy and use. And the market was telling us and telling the world that 72% of all vehicles, nearly 3/4, all went to trucks and SUVs. So he set out to build an unbelievably fun vehicle that you wanted to own that happens to be electric. And if we all buy those, we actually make a difference, right? Elon Musk, will have done more to change the world than almost anybody, because everybody said you can't do electric vehicles. And he's like, yeah, you can. He opened the door. I think the reason investors are so excited about that company is they say, okay, look, there's Tesla, and it's now valued at $1 trillion. And they don't sell trucks. They may sell a truck, the Cybertruck someday. I'm not sure if you want to buy one, but when I look at a Rivian, I get kind of excited. I've driven them. I have one on order. So the world has said, wait a second, the traditional OEMs aren't moving fast enough. They've not shown that they can be successful. And here's a company that has 50,000 pre-orders. And importantly, they have the largest e-commerce retailer on their side with the Amazon Prime van. And Amazon has said publicly, they will buy as many as Rivian can make, a minimum of 100,000. And so in RJ's mind, and Rob, this comes back to your question, he is changing the world by building a product that people need and want to use along the way. Now, on the valuation, it looks, I think my technical term, I used this last night, the technical term, it looks bananas. Because you say to yourself, they've sold a few trucks and now it's got $100 billion valuation. But what I think investors see here is an opportunity to be in the earliest stages of a company that is going to be production constrained, not demand constrained for the next 5 years. And if that is a true statement, those multiples will come in line very quickly. Now I will say, Remy, broadly defined, we are living in a world because of low interest rates and because of scarcity that people are paying up for software-defined as companies, and the multiples are crazy. But these are good companies. So valuation may be wrong, but the fundamental underpinning of the companies is not, is what I would say right now, which is very different than past periods that have looked ebullient like this.
So, on one hand, you have the company you just mentioned, you have Tesla, and the other hand, you have the Volkswagens of the world, right? Are those companies going to be able to change when you see this new opportunity emerging?
Rob, it's a great question. Volkswagen, Ford, and GM are all companies I think about, BMW as well. And there, let's use the GM example because that one's a little bit easier. GM has been early and right on the trends for 20 years. Electric vehicles, batteries, et cetera. They just can't execute. And part of the reason that I think the incumbents struggle to execute, Rob, and it goes back to Clay Christensen's seminal book, The Innovator's Dilemma, it's not that they don't see it, is they can't move their organization and structure their organization in order to capitalize on it. I mean, the issue, and here's where I see it, this will go back again to my intro comment about parallel stuff. If you pull a Tesla apart or a Rivian apart or a Lucid apart or a Polestar apart, which comes out of Volvo, those look like computers, less like vehicles. They have an integrated software stack. They understand the way semiconductors interact with software, et cetera. If you were to pull a traditional, ICE engine vehicle apart from any of the traditional OEMs, it looks like a car that would have been built 50 years ago that has some technology put into it on the side. It's not fundamentally integrated. I know Ford, for example, hired Doug Fields from Apple, and he's thinking about it. He's talking about the software-defined car because in order to be competitive, just think about all of like Volkswagen probably is the best manufacturer, I would argue, they and Toyota, of vehicles, fit, finish, design. They're beautiful. They're great to drive. They're exciting. Their skill set, though, is fit and finish to put together thousands of vehicles, millions of vehicles every year that are consistently terrific in the way that they operate. But they're not good at software. And so I really do wonder if they will be able to adjust. Now, I don't know if I can be promotional about companies you've invested in, Rob, but you turned me on to an incredibly cool company called Basemark out of Scandinavia and Finland. That company has captivated us because that's about a software-centric view of putting cars together, giving the auto OEMs a kind of this middleware software stack so they can focus what they're great on and get out of trying to do the software because they'll fail. They can't attract the talent, et cetera. And so it is trying to rethink. But there are people inside these companies, it's true of every company, not just the autos, where they grew up doing one thing. And they think that one thing is the most important part of the ecosystem, and they can't get their head out of it. So I do think the insurgents versus the incumbents have a leg up here, and I think it's really hard for the incumbents to adjust.
Well, Mark, one area, I totally agree with what you said, by the way. One area where GM almost got it right, you have to give them this credit, is on AV, autonomous car. Because they realized early enough that they were not going to be able to do it. It was in 2016, I believe, that they purchased Cruise. That was a long time ago because they were pretty sure that they would not be able to develop something meaningful in-house. And now through Cruise, they are probably one of the top 2 leading contenders in AV. Yeah? So they have learned a bit their lesson. Staying on the big trends, What about the dominance, the total dominance of US technology giants? You know that we are worried in Europe about that they could kill somehow innovation, not only in Europe, in the US as well. There is this worry that they could kill innovation just because of the weight that they are putting here.
Yeah, I spend time with those, I call them the $1 trillion club companies quite a bit. And so I think we have to go back and so antitrust was probably developed most from a legal framework originally in the United States, going back, a century ago with what's known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. And that was really about the railroads and the dominance there. And the theory of the case is typically more about harm to consumer, right? So look, I would actually tell you, sometimes I wonder if some of the bureaucracies around antitrust are concerned about the consumer as much as they are concerned about their own mission. And so when we talk about the big tech giants, what I would say is I've seen more good come out of the big tech giants in the last 10 years for mankind than has hurt mankind. I would say to you, if the regulator said, okay, look, like if you said, let's get rid of Facebook, it would not change my life. I don't use it. I don't actually like it very much. I don't like my kids using it. But if you told me I could no longer search on Google, if they would like to make my search worse, I would actually be pretty unhappy about that as a consumer. So the question that we're asking ourselves is, have the big guys stifled innovation? And I would say to you that if you look at what, I don't know if anybody uses YouTube, it's a pretty good product. You can upload your video, you can share video, et cetera. So they are dominant, but they're dominant because they built great products that people want to use. Now, I would tell you that I think that the framework for acquisitions, you had a bunch of bureaucrats that were all in love in tech and they wanted to say yes to everything in tech because they thought it was cool. And they did not provide the scrutiny that I think they should have done. And in particular, in the case of Facebook, they locked up mobile communication in a way that is probably detrimental to anybody getting into that space. So I'm not against, in fact, I'm quite pro-regulation. It just, to me, when we talk about this topic, I think we're a little too visceral in the way that we describe dominance. We use that umbrella term. And I think we have to say, to what purpose? Because the other thing is we talk about the environment. These big companies are very pro the environment, and they are doing everything they can to get. I saw the CEO of Amazon Web Services last week, and he's committed that every electron they use to power those data centers will come from renewable energy. So the question is innovation. I think there's a lot of innovation going on. I don't think people are stopping it. So again, I'm a little on the fence. I'm for regulation. I just would like smarter people to be in charge of the regulatory bodies.
Mark, I can't resist going back in our history of 25 years ago. Back in those days, you had a lot of fabulous semiconductor companies that were public, that were potential acquirers of startups. And, that was great. If you wanted to start a business, you could go see lots of different people that would hopefully take you out at a very high price. Then came consolidation. And of course, there's lots of other factors as well. But there are fewer buyers today for those types of businesses. And you could argue that the reason there's less innovation over there is because, there are a few behemoths sitting around. So if you look at that industry, aren't you a little bit worried that, that could carry through into other sectors as well? Or maybe it's not as big a deal as I think it is.
Well, there's a couple of parts to that, Rob. First of all, Google, Facebook, Amazon to a lesser extent, certainly not Apple, which would be the $1 trillion club, right, that people talk about, and certainly not really Netflix. They've actually had a mixed view on acquisitions. Google in the early days did a lot of stuff around search. And again, look, if the regulators had been smarter back in the day, you might have had a more competitive environment for digital advertising, because right now you don't have a competitive environment. You got to go through. And that's where I think the regulators on Google may have a point in terms of how, if you're a small business, you want to advertise, where do you go? But I can tell you that market is opening up in lots of different ways, whether it's Shopify, et cetera. But as it relates to acquisitions, Rob, they kind of take the dominance out of it. They got so big as companies based on their own organic growth that deals no longer move the needle for them. And so as a buyer, they become less interesting as a buyer for most companies because most companies aren't of a scale that move the needle. And so companies then need to build fundamental businesses that rely on their own business metrics to be successful, either to fundraise or go public. And that's always been hard, as you know. I would tell you, though, and this will come back to the point, I think, embedded in Remy's question, the regulators now have their eye on all of the big guys. And none of the big guys are going to be able to do deals for the next, I'd say, 24 months of any consequence. I think you see that Microsoft's acquisition of Nuance is being challenged by the EU right now. Not sure why they think that's a good thing, because there's lots of NLP out there. But and for medical, it's actually a wonderful boon if Microsoft owns it. But as a result, I think you're going to see 24 months where the big guys can't really do much. And so as a result, it's going to open the door for a lot of other people to do acquisitions. I think one other thing to talk about, Rob, kind of embedded in your point about liquidity and what happens to startups is what I affectionately refer to from 24 months ago as SPAC-a-palooza. In addition to the concentration you've seen with these big mega cap companies in the capital markets, we've had concentration on the asset side too. BlackRock's become enormous, Fidelity's become enormous. And in order to move the needle for them, a company to go public has to be doing 200 million of revenue or more and growing really quickly. And it's kind of shut the door for what you and I did back in the 90s for small cap IPOs. And when I look at the SPAC market, it's been volatile. And people, by the way, can barely spell SPAC. Is that a C or is that a K at the end? I'm trying to figure it out. But I look at the SPAC opportunity as a way to recreate that small cap, mid cap market for really good companies that aren't big enough for Fidelity and BlackRock to buy in the IPO, but could be great companies that have access to the capital markets. Right now, not a lot's going on in SPAC because the pendulum swung against them. But I think that comes back because I think the investors and the market need a place to bet on it. Remy, I'll come back to, because you set up the cruise thing. Like, I think the world of automation is legitimately a good thing for society. We see it in the supply chain today. We see a shortage of truck drivers. If you want to be a truck driver, you can have a job today. You can have a job for the rest of your life. There aren't enough of them. There will never be enough of them. But as a society, we are so dependent on a different supply chain now. We need commerce to move more efficiently. So there's an enormous opportunity for automation. But if you're an investor and you want to buy into automation, you can't. You can buy GM to try to get to Cruise, but you get a lot of GM with that and a lot of Cruise. If you want to buy Waymo, you can buy Alphabet, but you get a lot of Alphabet and other things and very little Waymo. And so what the SPACs opened up is a chance for you to invest directly into autonomy if you believe that's a good trend. And the poster child would be Aurora. You've also seen it with Embark in the trucking space. So to me, Rob, your point, I think, embedded is we need more liquidity options for companies to be viable and to be funded. And we're trying to find ways to make that happen.
So we have been talking about the big US companies. What is your view on the paradox of the Chinese giants? That if we stay on the autonomous car, on the one hand, the big guys on autonomous car, the Beidou and others, they are benefiting from relaxed regulation to authorize them to start operation and therefore to gain a lot of knowledge through the accumulation of data, more lenient regulation than what we see in the US or in Europe. But at the same time, there is kind of tighter control on those Chinese giants. What is your view on this formidable battle between the US and China here?
Yeah, I am candidly trying to figure this one out, Remy. I've spent a lot of time. I've probably been to China 40 times. I've not eaten the exotic foods that Rob did when he traveled after college there. Again, Rob and I are friends going way back. But I am, so my first couple of, like, I like most people, you read about a country, but until you walk and meet the people, it's really hard to have context. But when I first landed in China, when I was senior at JP Morgan, it was kind of one of these heads of state visits. We all exchanged gifts. We sat at a big table. We had translators. But that night I went to dinner with the working people. And their first question to me was, tell me about stock options. Right? It was a very commercial, how do we build great companies, less about politics, et cetera. And I was encouraged by that because there was a vibrancy to that conversation. And I would tell you, whether it was going to Taiwan and talking about China, or here on the West Coast of the US talking about China, there was this very vibrant conversation. And people are now really questioning if there will be cooperation. And so I'm told that the Great Wall of China wasn't built to keep people out, it was built to keep people in. I don't know if that's true or not, but I would tell you that I feel like the regulations the Chinese government is putting on place right now is to keep their companies in. And I think it's going to have effect of keeping everybody else out, and their technology will increasingly look like Huawei to the rest of the world. There will be no autonomous vehicles sold with autonomous software coming out of China to anywhere else in the world. That is my prediction. And nobody who builds outside of China will sell there. And the reason is, and think about this, let's just go to trucking. If you can't trust that we live by a common standard, that this isn't government, that this is commercially driven, not government driven with oversight, an 80-ton vehicle driving down the road really fast is kind of scary. And I want to make sure that I have safeguards around where that technology is built and controlled. And we're now starting to set this up as a China versus the world kind of thing. Now, maybe the Chinese domestic market is completely sufficient for all of the Chinese companies to be successful, but historically, that has not been a good bet. And I'm befuddled by why we are doing this. I don't see it as good for anybody on either side of that equation.
Hey, Mark, out of curiosity, how has it affected your business directly?
So honestly, it's like when I was at, we host an unbelievably great semiconductor forum. One of my partners, Tim Luke, hosted here in Silicon Valley, and we had it. And anybody who pays attention to TSMC, they have committed, I think, publicly to spend $50 billion on fab production. Almost all of that's now going to non-Chinese sites. And so, Rob, for us, what it means is increasingly people are starting to say to themselves, people are nervous about Taiwan, not because of the geopolitical US, but we can't have TSMC taken over. The rest of the world can't have that happen. Like, we need access to it. And so people are quickly starting to say, if China is no longer my market, where do I sell to if I can't sell into there? And that's always been kind of a weird thing. But interestingly, they're saying, hey, now I have to worry a lot less about Alibaba and Tencent and all those companies because they're going to get blocked out. And for all of the silliness of the US government politics and presidents of the recent past, right? You might see more debates around a TikTok-like thing and what that really means going forward. And it's being permissioned by the Chinese because they're basically saying you are not welcome here. And I don't understand why they're doing it. It's befuddling to me and sad. But it opens up the door, Rob, for people to compete. And in Europe, like, we should talk about Europe. Like, Rob, you and I have been going, like, I've been coming to see you and we've been traveling to Europe. I've been going for all of my professional life. I've always been waiting for the renaissance of Europe and software development to come to the fore. I think certainly as it relates to the environment and the things that you invest in, Europe is the leader. They have been for a long period of time. And I think with China kind of doing this, I think it opens up the door for product market entry, because I think the US is very open to European companies and collaboration there. And particularly as it relates to anything around the environment, I think there's a great opportunity.
Obviously, we believe that. We think Europe leads when it comes to sustainability. And I think it's because governments are very much on side. They've been on side for a long time, as opposed to when administrations change, as they do in the US. Large corporates are on side, whether Unilever, Danone, et cetera. everybody is trying to build a sustainable company here. And what I think is also very special about Europe is we have a populace that's on side. Just look at Germany in the last national election, I think 15-16% voted for the Green Party. So there's a real demand for sustainable products and services in Europe. And that's all very good for the entrepreneur. But I guess the obvious question I have for you is, do you see that, right? Or do you see the world through if you would, a Silicon Valley lens, where you say, if it's not created here, it can't be as good?
No, I don't think that's true. I don't think there's a bias to say that it has to be here. I would say from a funding bias, the venture capitalists on the West Coast don't like to travel very far. And so if they can invest in something that they can drive to, they would rather do that. With this world of Zoom that we're living in now, maybe that starts to change. I think having venture capitalists like you in Europe and your ability to invest directly and meet the entrepreneurs is a big competitive advantage, because I think it's been the venture capital issue, not the intellect and not the business acumen, that's been the bigger issue for the success of companies in Europe. But I do want to come back and double click on something you said, Rob. When you go through the three constituents you described in Europe, the European, headquartered companies, Unilever as an example, and you talk about the populace, I'm all in favor of that. The place that Europe makes me nervous is your bureaucracy and your governmental organizations. And I have to be super careful because we may be regulated by some European entities too. I think the regulators are incredibly well intended. I just find that anytime you get with governments, they're just not thinking all the way through. So I'd much rather have a Rivian that has no government subsidies whatsoever, getting out there and selling a product that people want to buy, and they'll pay a premium for it because it's wonderful and it gets mass adoption, than trying to mandate adoption, because I just feel like mandates don't work very well. And to the previous panelists' points, anytime you get into subsidies, we saw it here as it related to, clean tech back in, the 2000s, you end up with these weird distortions that companies anchor on the subsidy more than they do the fundamentals, and they don't build great companies. But I am all like, I think a number of great companies are going to come out of Europe because you have the right companies. And by the way, big companies, but also startups who see the world slightly differently from that mission-driven perspective that you described, and they're going to build great products and great services that meet a need commercially, and then the governments will catch up later. That's my bias.
Since on many technologies, the big incumbents will be unable to develop those innovation, and they will have to do what GM did with Cruise and pay a very hefty price to acquire some of this asset. Do you see that as one of the big trends that will maintain M&A valuation at a historical level?
So it's a timely question. I would tell you that, so first of all, GM doesn't get nearly enough credit for what it's done. But Cruise has been hard for them. Just as an example, they had to set up a different compensation program. They had to leave them alone more than they wanted to. And then ultimately, Dan Ammann, who was the heir apparent to Mary Barra to run General Motors, stepped down to become the CEO to give it the credibility. I would say big companies have antibodies. They have cultures and things like that. And those antibodies can kill innovation through kindness. Like everybody wants to be part of it. Rob and I nearly experienced that when our boutique investment bank was acquired by a big, New York-based money center bank, though we one of the only to survive. So it takes real effort. I would say that because you can see like the fact that Rivian is valued at more than General Motors and more than Ford, they're all saying, what are we doing wrong? And so they are seeing that they need to do something different. I think they see acquisition as the way to do it. But the C-suite conversation and the board of director conversation is, if we have to pay this hefty price, are we going to kill it? Can we bring these people in and let them thrive? And I would say to you, I think the template has been baked in Silicon Valley. Cisco now, when they do acquisitions, they were one of the most acquisitive companies for 2 decades. They just leave the company alone. Used to be when you were acquired by Cisco, on the day you joined, you'd go out to a company event. And when you came back, you would have your Cisco badge and your Cisco business cards on your desk because you were now part of the family and they wanted you integrated and they wanted you part of the big Cisco thing. Now they do the opposite. They don't change anything. They leave you alone because they want you to keep your culture, keep your innovation cycle. And so I'm having this, honestly, I'm in front of boards of directors right now with some of the biggest companies outside of technology, having this very conversation, Remy. Can they do acquisition and not stifle innovation? And that is the debate. They absolutely want to do it because they don't think they can get to scale fast enough, but their real fear is their own ability to execute.
Hey, Mark, the other question we have is on technology trends. What's hot? And you can't say Meta.
I promise I wouldn't say Meta. So what I would tell you is super hot right now is to go back to my opening comments about the parallelism that you're seeing in innovation. For a long time, you've heard the buzzword of AI and ML. Again, I am so old that I remember when AI was cool the first time coming out of Stanford, and that was in the 90s. Rob and I worked for some really cool companies. But I would tell you there's a lot of jargon out of Silicon Valley. If we can't, dazzle them with brilliance, we'll try to baffle you with something else. And we use these jargons. But what I'm seeing now is if you look at what NVIDIA has done, what a company out of the UK is doing, GraphCore, there is increasingly this integration. So the greatest, let me take a step back to maybe make a bunch of sense. The greatest integration of hardware and software is the iPhone. I have had the pleasure of working with Apple for 30 years, going back to Next and the people that built those companies. But the greatest integration you've ever seen is that. And Apple builds their own semiconductors. And as a result of building those semiconductors now, they increasingly give you features and functionalities that are power efficient, they're performant, et cetera. That's now coming to everybody else. And the way that's coming to everybody else is through the cloud. So again, Amazon introduces the Graviton, which is their own semiconductor, and they're starting to tune semiconductors to actually deal with AI and ML. And so if you're an average business and you really want to start to go through the heaps of data that you have to fine tune it so that you can actually deliver real insights and values, you can do it so inexpensively now and with such a high fidelity that we're starting to see real changes. And I think here, as it relates to the environmental movement, when you start to think about the ability, because again, we're all in favor of conservation and doing things better, right? Making the impact of every electron we use in the world or every BTU that we use to be more impactful in what we do. But if you think of the way people design houses, when you think about all of the stuff that's coming, the underpinning technology and the ability to have sophisticated tools without having to have heaps of data scientists, it's now going to be at your fingertips. I mean, I'm probably not going to be able to design my own algorithm for how I do banking better, but I'm going to have people that can do it. And then that means for every company that you back, every company that is out there getting started up, the panoply of tools available to run your business better, it's never been more exciting. I'm super nerdy, by the way. Let me confess up front. You should have said chief nerd at Barclays. I am that. But I just see so much innovation around data now, but backed up by speed and hardware at costs that are so low, every company can use it. That's probably the most exciting thing we're seeing right now, Rob.
By the way, I would agree and disagree on one of the points that you have mentioned on the greatest innovation around the iPhone. As you probably know, Steve Jobs has invented nothing in his life. He has been stealing from everybody, starting with the mouse from the Xerox lab in the 70s. But where you are absolutely right is that superb integration, superb user experience is in fact the innovation that he has been bringing again and again. But that's kind of a paradox. He has been always the last one to adopt a new technology. But with a superb user experience, that is making the whole difference.
Remy, I personally worked with Steve Jobs a lot over my career. In fact, my second day at work was at the Next board of directors, and there was Steve Jobs. And all I wanted to do is not say something stupid and get fired. I succeeded at that. But the one thing, but again, that your point is actually worth just spending a second about, right? Which is, you're right. Like when it comes to the iPod back in the day with music, there were lots of MP3 players. They just weren't very good, right? I could put 10 songs on and the way I recorded them, and if I stole music, whatever. His genius was the application of technology in ways people wanted to use it. And then once he got the idea, to make it better and better and better. And so you're right, he didn't innovate, he didn't invent it, but he understood how to use it. And more people need to do that because the tools here are here for them to use it. Now let's apply them, right, in ways that people want to consume.
Agree.
So Mark, maybe last few questions here, just on sustainability in general. I know Barclays is a big commitment to the space right now, and you might want to talk a little bit about what your team is doing, and just how you see, some of the trends in terms of sustaining tech as a very specific niche of that.
Yeah, Rob, thank you for asking that, because it is actually embedded increasingly in the fabric of how we run our business. And so there are multiple dimensions to that. So the first one would be just our chairman, Nigel, has been on the record. We have committed to be net zero by 2050. We're already net zero as it relates to our operations, but by 2050, we will not, all of our customers and the people that we work with need to be net zero. And so we are quickly working down a plan. So 2050 sounds like it's a long time from now, but if you think about how hard that is, it's really difficult. So we, Barclays, will not be financing any fossil fuels or anything in the future of consequence. We've got good clients in that space that we're helping in terms of their transition. So I think with Shell, we may have financed the largest solar array they've ever done. So we're working very collaboratively because they're good clients and good people that we want to work with, but we're not going to help them as it relates to financing things that aren't good for the environment. Sasha Wiggins leads our sustainability effort. And so as a result of that, we look pervasively across our ecosystem. And so every time we take on a new assignment, we go through a questionnaire and we say, does this company involved in one of two things? Something that's against the United Nations kind of list of important things for the climate, and protected lands, et cetera. And then the other one we're actually quite concerned about is military and weapons. We won't do anything that is related to offensive weapons as well. So as a firm, that's just part of everything we do now. We go through that and we consciously do check on all of that. And then in addition to that, Rob, we were the first bulge bracket investment bank to create a sustainable impact banking group that just specifically focuses on companies in this category, because we think it's a category onto itself with different attributes that have to be evaluated. And I spend a lot of time partnering with that group. Now I'm a global chairman. I'm one of 7 global chairmen of the firm. So I do lots of things, but this is one of my side projects where I spend a lot of time because I'm trying to understand the intersection of sustainability and impact and technology. Because I actually think that if you don't embed technology, because technology helps you get to a price point and gives you leverage so that you can be commercially viable. So we spend a lot of time on that, Rob. It's fundamental to everything that we do, and we are committed to it in each and every way that I can think of.
Excellent. Well, with that, we are at the half-hour mark, and I saw our next panelist, Ed, just quickly pop up to the screen. But Mark, I should say thank you very much for what was a really engaging discussion. Thank you also to Remy for joining me as a questioner. And I think we really appreciate you spending the time, especially very early on the West Coast there. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Rob, both for your friendship, your partnership, Remy, Patrick. We do consider ourselves very privileged to be a partner to ETF. You're a great organization with the right ethics, and I will say, we, as you know, we really like the companies you've invested in, several of which we're actively working with right now on things. And so hopefully here's to many years of getting together and doing this again. I would only hope that at some point in the not too distant future, we could do this together in person. It would be great to see you all. And for anybody that's going to have to shelter in place and return for home, wishing everybody a healthy and joyous holiday season. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Remy. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Talks podcast. To find out more or join as a guest, head over to the ETF Partners website at etfpartners.capital. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Medium at ETF Partners. Until next time, thanks for listening.